Good evening, everybody. Welcome to tonight's edition of Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. So, as usual, Shop Talk is Monday night after work, kicking back, talk a little bit of data platform related stuff, chat Q&A. That's how it normally is. Tonight, it's going to be totally different. By which I mean we're going to do exactly the same thing as we always do, because does this look like a high energy stream? Speaking of high energy people, we have Mike Christensen. How you doing, Mike?
Doing very well, thanks. Hello, everybody.
And speaking of other high energy people, Mala. How you doing, Mala?
Doing well. Good evening, everyone.
So we've got Mike and Mala here to keep the energy high. I'm just here to get trolled and run us off of a cliff, rhetorically speaking, in the midst of a rant. So, in case this is your first time, welcome. If you have questions, you want to talk something data platform related, drop it in chat. Chat is welcome. This is Monday. Depending on what time zone you're in, it may actually be Tuesday, which might be worse. So I'm not sure because if we think about the philosophy behind this, it is one day closer to the weekend, but it also means you're more in the middle of the slog. I'm going to believe it's Tuesday. All right, that's fine. Though in that case, we'd have to get ready for our presentation. Wait, yes, data science and business intelligence presentation is tomorrow at this time. So, got a couple topics. First topic comes from you, Mala, and it involves a hint that I'm not a big fan of. A query hint, to give you a hint. So, Mala, what do we got here?
So I had an older system that I was looking at, some legacy-based system that is currently on 2016, I think. Yeah, 2016. I have no clue who are the authors, anything. We just inherited this piece of software, a database. I don't even know what the app is that touches it. But I was looking at it. It looks like a package processing thing of some sort, like FedEx and UPS parcels and such. So anybody who has a parcel has an entry in a table, and then something else comes and picks it up and maybe talks to FedEx or UPS and sends it on. So it's something like that, a package processing kind of a system. And they have a lot of queries with this read past hint on it. That was what I saw. I mean, it's heavy on deadlocks. It's deadlocks everywhere and table scans everywhere. It's a horrendous system. From what I could see. But this interested me because I haven't seen this hint in at least a decade anywhere. And I don't think I've used it personally. I know it was on my list of things to not do some years ago. Kind of like the no lock hint. So I know what it does. But my thought was, did they not get any other way of doing this? And is that really so? And I spoke to Kimberly briefly on it, if she has seen anything like it. And she said it is very commonly in use even now. And it serves that purpose that I was seeing in that, like some kind of a queue processing system where, something comes along and takes a few rows, and the rows that it picks up are locked. And then something else come along. Another example would be like Ticketmaster, buying tickets, that sort of a thing. So some kind of a queue processing, she said, it is not at all a bad thing to use in such scenarios. So I wanted to get Kevin's take on it and understand more. That's it.
So there are a couple good articles that I like on the topic. One of them is from SQL Shack, Rajendra Gupta, who gives a quick overview of the read past query hint. So if this is something you have not seen before, the idea of read past is, like Mala mentioned, suppose that you've got some data in a table, and in this case, this is a set of product data. Now, somebody has begun a transaction, and they've performed an update operation. So they've set the product name equal to Mac for products 1 and 2, which is a problem because I don't know that the surrogate key is real. And now we have duplicate tuples, but I am definitely in normalization mode thanks to some videos that are coming out soon. But nonetheless, the point here being, all right, you've begun a transaction, you've performed an update, and now somebody else wants to query this data. Well, if you use no lock, which is short for yes, it does lock, you can get dirty reads, which is essentially saying we're going to show you what the state of this is, even if there are open transactions, as long as we can get access to it, which doesn't always happen. But if you can, you get to see data that may be wrong, that may roll back, and that you'll never be able to replicate. Kind of a problem with no lock. But if you use read past, what you see is that data just doesn't appear. So what read past is doing is it's essentially saying, is there a row lock on this particular row? If there is, ignore it, keep going. And we can see, you might be able to see the image here. So we're getting a, there's a, okay, intent lock here, but an actual lock on the key. So basically we're locking these two rows because of the dirty read, but we're able to see past them and find the other items. And the article goes on a little bit more and talks about things like, well, what happens when you perform updates using read past? What happens when other people are using read past? And what actually is happening with the read past operation? In this case, Rajendra tells a story about, oh, well, we had one scenario where some of the updates weren't actually working, and it's because they were just reading past some data that the developers thought actually should have been read. But for a queue table, where instead of maybe having products and you want to see, here are the products that are currently not being updated, it could be, I have a set of queue items. So I've got 10, like the Ticketmaster example, I've got 10,000 people waiting in a queue for 300 tickets. And now we're going to have some number of application readers say, give me the top one from the queue where with read past, so that if I'm actively working on that one, I'm going to be able to operate on it without having to feel worried that somebody else some other reader is currently accessing that and will begin working on it. And like Lewis says, if you don't know how a tool works, it's pretty much always bad. Yeah, kind of. Would agree. So it is often useful for those sort of queuing scenarios where you want to pull in a small batch of records to process, and you tend to have parallel operations. If you only have one processor, it doesn't really matter. If your processors are staggered so that they're not both going to try to read the same thing at the same time, doesn't really matter. If your outputs are all idempotent, to where if two processors process the same record, you get still the same outcome as before, doesn't matter. But where it does matter is if you have parallel operations and non-idempotent actions, like purchasing items or being in line to make a purchase. So in those cases, read past can potentially work. And I have to say can potentially work. By the way, let me drop in that link because it's a thing I do. Can potentially work, but not necessarily. A nice Eric Darling blog post indicating, oh, well, read past doesn't work if you're taking, say, page level locks. So in this case, Eric has a table where he's updating u.reputation is some number, and there's no index on reputation, which means it's scanning all of users to figure out who has that reputation value. And in that case, we're seeing page level locks on the index name PK user's ID. So because there's a page level lock, if you use read past, you're blocked. It's blocking entire ranges as opposed to individual rows. So even if there's only one person who has a reputation of that value, the fact that we took out the page level lock here prevents us from reading any of those other rows. So then you say, all right, well, in my original query, I'll say with row lock, So it can't read to the next page. That's a good question. I would have to check that. I don't want to try to make a guess off the top of my head. But I was curious originally because there's no index on here. My expectation was that it was effectively doing a full table scan. So
That's what where the place where I'm looking at is doing scans like that, and there are lots of deadlocks, lots and lots.
yeah. So you could say in this case with row lock, and then now you're only taking that lock on any row where reputation is equal to this. And knowing that this is a fairly uncommon value for reputation, we wouldn't expect to see too many rows that end up getting locked that way. And in fact, in his lock results, we can see request count equals 1. So there was only one row that had a reputation of 1,047,863. In that case, we got the one row that was locked, but the select query with read pass is still locked because it turns out that the read query is trying to lock pages rather than rows. So read pass,
Interesting.
yeah, read pass was trying to lock as well because there's no good index to allow it to search. So it's going to say, well, I better lock this page because I'm in read committed mode, and I want to make sure that nobody's updating this data under me. So with read passed and row lock, there we go. Then the query finishes, or you create an index on reputation, and now you're performing seeks, and then it's easier to operate on. You don't need the row lock hints because we only get back one row. Although if you say now with anybody with a reputation equal to 0, there's a lot of users with zeros, so I'm going to guess that would still end up blocking you there. So read pass clearly won't work with full table scans, but in read committed, I didn't think that would lock the entire table, would it?
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think here, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that this, because of the fact that it's having to scan the entire table, is probably why you're seeing that lock happen across the board. But again, I'd have to try it out myself to know for sure. Going off of what Eric says here, but it's a good question. So I will have to try that out and see.
I'll try it tomorrow. I definitely have to mess around with some. I have some active table scans going and stuff going on with that database, so I have a really good opportunity to check it out.
Okay. All right. So Mala will report back.
Yes, do it next week.
Well, 2 weeks from now.
Yeah, 2 weeks from now.
Next week I'll be in somewhere in the UK. Data relays next week. So
Oh, cool.
actually, it'll be depending on the time of day. I'll either be in Bletchley Park or wherever the second city is this year. I don't know. They put us on a bus and then drive us, and thankfully, I'm the last person they would ask to drive the bus, so I don't have to know where we're going.
Well, you're going to be driving a bus.
Yeah. So the way data relay works is
Oh, that's hilarious. Kevin, you should bring pictures of that.
I won't be driving the bus. No,
Okay.
they hire bus drivers.
Hmm.
But the idea is that it's 5 cities in 5 days, and you have speakers like me who come in and like, I'm not going to drive in the UK. So how do you get to the different places? Well, the organizers also need to be able to bring all of the sponsor materials. They need to bring all of the accoutrements, all the stuff that you would put up at a conference, all the swag that they're handing out, all this kind of stuff. And so they load it all up in a bus, along with any of the speakers who want to take the bus, and that takes us to the next city. It's usually about a 1.5 to 2 hour drive because it's always during drive time, and knowing that it's like an 8 to 5 conference. So we hit British drive time because I've looked at distances before and I've said, this isn't that far of a distance. Why is it taking 2 hours? And the answer is, oh, we're leaving at 5 p.m. That's why. But then get to the next city, have dinner, go to hotel room, wake up the next morning, repeat the process. And by Friday, you're completely worn out. And it's you begin to ask the questions like, why did I agree to do this in the first place? And I will never do this again. And then next year comes around and you're like, yeah, of course I want to do this. But Andrew Prusky used to be involved in data relay. He is not involved this year, but he has done the torment and pain of having to organize this, not just being a speaker who gets to ride in the back of the bus and take a nap for an hour. Yeah, everything. Yeah, driving in the UK does take a lot longer than it feels like. When you look at distances, even road traveled distance, not necessarily as the crow flies, you'd say this isn't that bad. And it's not like the speed limits are really low or something. It's just there's a lot of traffic, especially pick the wrong time of day, like when everybody's trying to go home, and it takes a while.
I'm sure it does take a while. Yeah.
Also on read past, Tracy, so many roundabouts. Yeah, that's true. Those will slow you down. They don't stop you necessarily unless, people get stuck on them, but they will slow you down for sure. So Tracy wanted to add in as well. She couldn't be here tonight, but regarding ReadPass, she had a vendor system that hadn't been updated in years, and they had issues a few months ago where she ended up having to make the primary key a clustered index so it would quit having issues because they were using heap tables as queues with millions of rows using an order by. And moral of the story is, turns out that those sorts of queries don't perform well when you don't have good indexes. It's the more you know.
We have roundabouts here too.
That is true. There are roundabouts. There's a reasonable number in the U.S., definitely more than there were 20 years ago. Although, honestly, I think some of the roundabouts in the Triangle area are just so that they can claim it's a roundabout. Because if your roundabout says, get into the right-hand lane to exit in the first lane, and then get into the left-hand lane to exit in the second or the third, that's not a roundabout. That's just a very bad...
I was the only one that I found that amusing. I don't find annoyance with that. It helps me actually, but it's kind of amusing because that's not how it is in Europe with roundabouts.
Yeah, like that's not how roundabouts are supposed to work. You have the round ring to exit, and you have the round ring to travel around within. And it's the highways that are weird. Places where we'd usually have bridges on a 55-mile-an-hour road. Yeah, where we'd have various types of junctions. You'd have, I could pull up Google Maps and we could start talking. We could start nerding out on interstate bridge layouts. But yeah, definitely. That is an advantage of having a whole lot of space available. So you're not trying to pack the roads in pretty tightly. And instead you can have, here's a quarter-mile clover leaf, because that quarter-mile clover leaf allows everybody to drive 45 to 50 in any direction, on or off, and doesn't really affect the people who are getting on there, as long as you set it up correctly so that the people exit the freeway before the next people get onto the freeway. There are places that have that backwards, and it turns out that's really bad for traffic. Usually more residential, 30 or so mile an hour road. Yeah, we see it. That's a lot of the cases where I see them here in the Triangle as well, Lewis. So it's probably the same thing. It's that we want to have a roundabout because it feels like, this is a very pleasant neighborhoody thing to do. We don't want to have a stoplight. And then you just say, yes, but you also have like 3 cars a minute. You could actually have a stop sign and everybody could stop and it'd still be okay. But the roundabout looks nicer, so they put in the big roundabout. Digress. Well, this is shop talk. Digression is definitely expected. We factor it in when we put together the docket. So, on to our second topic. Second topic actually is a Simple Talk blog post from Ben Johnston. This is continuing a series. So I highlighted a previous article on this a couple of weeks ago. And this one is all about row-level security attacks. And so it came out this morning. I wanted to follow up with it. I hope this is right. Yes, it is. It's a good article. I was curious what Ben was going to put in for row-level security attacks because I didn't really find I didn't find any row-level security attacks that I would look at and say, oh, this is catastrophically dumb. Like dynamic data masking, where there's a catastrophically dumb workaround for it that is just trivially easy to work around, and now your data masking doesn't actually help because you can, as long as somebody has select access to the table, they can very easily get answers. And Ben breaks this up, direct attacks, indirect attacks, and side channel attacks. So direct attack, I would summarize this as if you have permission to stop row-level security, then you can stop row-level security. I don't think it's necessarily a problem with row-level security itself, but things like if you can modify the access predicate. Well, all right, if you've got that ability, if you have those permissions, then you're going to have, like in this scenario, maybe you're messing with their automated DevOps environment. Okay, that's fair. So it's not at all wrong. I would also counter it as that is more of a supply chain attack than a row-level security problem. So it's useful to know about, but it's not something that Microsoft could prevent, because essentially you're saying if you give somebody the ability to turn off or to change the predicate, then they could change the predicate, is ultimately what it comes down to. So control who's allowed to change the predicate. Similarly, disabling row-level security, if you have the permissions to do so. So yes, if you have that capacity, then you're going to be able to get around row-level security. Now, where things get a little bit more interesting is especially using session context, because that was one of the mechanisms that he had used in one of the earlier posts to give you an idea of how can we use row-level security efficiently without having to query from a table for every row in our other table, because, well, that will not perform well at all. So if you use session context to tell you this is the context of the user who's going to be allowed to access this row, then if somebody knows how you've got session context laid out, they could update that session context. And users may have permission to update that session context. So if you've granted them that access, then they could abuse that and get the context of somebody else. So I'd consider that a legitimate, not necessarily a flaw of row-level security, but again, a thing that you need to think about as that whole security posture. It's where you have a lot of parts that are all trying to work together, and in the process, you got to make sure that they all are working appropriately, that you don't have any gaps. Similarly, if you can execute as a user, if you can impersonate somebody else's account, yeah, you're going to be able to see row-level security as that person. And I do that in a demo, so that's perfectly expected behavior. Just don't grant randos the ability to impersonate people whose data you don't want to see. One interesting thing that he pointed out was system version temporal tables. And so there is not a way to access the temporal tables in a normal way without removing row-level security. But if the history table is disconnected from a primary and not tied to row-level security, you could potentially read the history table. So the idea here is that if you have a temporal table and you have row-level security will work just fine with that temporal table. It'll allow you to see the present data and the past data associated with your session or with your user context. We'll call it that. So you will only be able to see the rows that you're allowed to see versus all of the rows. However, if you break the temporal table, which requires first that you turn off row-level security for that table, then you turn off system versioning for that table, then you could turn back on row-level security for the present table, the current table. That history table will not necessarily have row-level security on it because the predicate is looking at the current table as opposed to the history table. So that's a potential thing that if you have a lot of tables that go from being temporal to being non-temporal and you want to keep the historical data, keep in mind. Indirect attacks, these also fit in the bucket of, yes, it's not strictly speaking a row-level security attack, but it's something you want to think about with securing a system. Like, if I can get copies of your backups and I'm able to restore your backups, in that case, I can do that on a system where I am sysadmin, and therefore I can disable any of the row-level security predicates or just row-level security on a table that I want to, because at that point I'm sysadmin. If somebody basically says, all right, I'm not going to query your table, I'm going to go query your source system, then, well, yeah, that could also be a problem. Again, it's not a Microsoft problem. That's a company. You got to control your data problem. But something to think about as you're e-tailing data around is who has access to that data in different states, and is any of that data sensitive enough that an attacker who could get access to it would benefit from it. So something I think, at least I think a fair number of people gloss over is that, yes, we can control the final output data, but that all of those inputs along the way also need to be controlled. If a service account is gathering data, so what could happen here is your service account can see 100% of the rows, and then maybe it has its own row-level security implementation. Well, in that case, you've pushed the problem up to, well, now your service account code can be attacked the same way. So that could be an interesting mechanism of attack. You can use certain DBCC commands, like DBCC page, to at least see some of the data. So in this case, DBCC IND allows us to see certain information of values. We can look at statistics and we can see what are the statistics ranges, because those are going to be real values, and it's going to be all of the data, not just the data that's viewable for your particular user. There's no per user or per user context statistics. It's all statistics on the table, which means that if somebody's allowed to read those statistics DMVs and see what the values are on a given statistic, they won't be able to see all of the information, but they could see some of it. And if it's a small enough table, they might be able to see all of it. If you've got a small enough number of rows that you've got one row per step, then yeah, you can see all of it. Or if you have, let's say, 50 or fewer unique steps, or unique values, I should say. You could also use DBCC page and read the data directly this way. So again, generally you're going to need view server state or sysadmin. You're going to need some level of permissions that JRandom user hopefully doesn't have, but inevitably does, because we granted sysadmin to everybody because the application developers claim they require it.
No.
The vendor definitely needs it. Absolutely needs it. No question about it. Our application that only reads and writes to 2 tables in one database. Look, we got to be sysadmin. But that's another story. So being able to read pages, yeah, that's interesting attack that I wouldn't necessarily think about, but it does get around row level security. So if you have targeted values, like you know what pages a particular set of sensitive information is on, or at least you know what table it's in, you might be able to piece this back together and find something that you shouldn't have access to. They may eventually need that elevated security to alter a row. I mean, that's true. That's true. Now, he also notes that this, if you're using Azure SQL Database, DBCC page is not going to be supported, so that vector is not an issue. But if you are using on-premises SQL Server or SQL Server in a VM or SQL managed instance, yeah, you can still use DBCC page. And the third set, there's another sequence related thing, but the third one, this one gets into, yes, it is, I would say, a somewhat legitimate attack, but it's a real doozy of an attack. So the idea here is that, and I just started it clicked why this is going to happen once I started explaining the row level security process a little bit. But you can cause a divide by 0 error on a row that would get filtered out. And the reason is that the divide by 0 operation is going to happen before the predicate is applied. So you're going through each row, and like in this case, select star from sales.customers where customer ID equals 801 and the quantity 1 divided by the quantity credit limit minus 3,000 equals 0. So if credit limit is 3,000, you're going to say 1 divided by the quantity 3,000 minus 3,000, or 1 divided by 0, or error message 8134, divide by 0 error encountered. Well, if you get this divide by 0 error, that means this credit limit is definitely 3,000. So if you know enough information to narrow down to a specific row that you're able to get to, and you are patient enough to try these sorts of attacks out, you could figure this out. You could get the actual number. So you could make credit limit a variable and basically say loop through, like here, while the customer ID is less than 901. So get the first 100 customers, while the credit limit is less than 10,000, and we haven't figured out what the customer's credit limit is. We are going to insert into this table where customer ID equals this and 1 divided by credit limit minus credit limit equals 0. If this actually succeeds, then we ignore this because 1 divided by anything is not going to be equal to 0. But if you just happen, so basically this row will not insert. But if you happen to hit a case where credit limit is equal to your variable at credit limit, this also will fail, but it'll drop you in the catch block. And now we can say, oh, good, we know what credit limit is. And you can do this and have, in this case, I suppose that we're going to have up to 10,000 separate operations for each one of these 100 customers. So at that point, you're talking like 10 million queries, of which you'll find roughly 100 of them fail with divide by 0 errors. This is definitely a more of a long game, considering that this is to get one column's value. So not trivial, but it also works with strings. And with strings, it's even funnier because we're saying, well, if the substring from 1 to 1 is E, then give us a 0, otherwise a 1. So loop through all of the possible string values, which gets real fun when you think in varchar and you have Unicode. But even if you stick to ASCII characters, there's enough ASCII characters that also, even if you stick to the classic 26 lowercase, 26 uppercase, 10 digits, if that's all you have to think about, then even in that case, you're still looking at 62 possibilities, 62 queries that you're running per character. And I think you would also have to know either how long this string is. So we may have to have like a case when the length of the string is greater than whatever, check in here somewhere. But you could theoretically reverse back to the actual string value. And there is a script here that will allow you to do it. It does use a cursor, but considering that we're going to be looping for a while, cursor may not be the worst option. Not doing this at all would be the best option. But if you're going to do it, cursor may work. Now, I'm pretty sure fast forward may be a good idea for the cursor. There are probably like 3 other settings that I never think about with cursors, because at that point, does it even matter? Does life even matter anymore? And the answer is probably not. But grab those 100 rows, check the substring length, so we're checking the length of the customer name where customer ID is equal to whatever, and check the inner character length. It's always good to remind people this is not something we're suggesting to do, but more to watch out for. Yeah, that's fair, Lewis. This is not guidance. This is actually there is a note down at the bottom of how do you prevent against this particular attack, and the way to mitigate it is look for a whole bunch of divide by 0 errors associated with the same user, and then start asking questions of that user. What exactly are you doing here? But this script, I'm going to guess, takes quite a while to run. And it does eventually get you back column types in a table. So it'll at least give you information that you could look into further. So the best way to detect these sorts of attacks, log and actively monitor for error number 8134, which is divide by 0 encountered. And there's a follow-on post that's probably going to come out. My guess is next week. But there will be tools for monitoring mitigation techniques in more specific detail. But I would also say overall, this style of attack, this is probably the only one, the side channel attack is the only one that I would look at and say, okay, that's arguably a row level security problem. And as opposed to you just need to not do dumb things, or you need to secure the supply chain type of problem. So this is the only case where I would look at it and say, yeah, I wish that row level security behaved a little bit differently. I wish that instead of performing this calculation, this where clause filter, it would perform the security check, the predicate check first. But then I got thinking about that, and if you figure, let's say we put row level security on a table with 1 billion rows. Let's say I have access to 100 million rows. Well, my row level security predicate probably is not the most unique part of a predicate. Inside this where clause, where customer ID equals 801 is probably going to be more unique. And so it seems that in this predicate, we're filtering down first. And then there's the security predicate that gets applied after the fact. So that's why we still get a divide by 0 error. And it would be great if there were some Microsoft response that on a divide by 0 error in a row level security query, I don't know, maybe the behavior is different. I'm not even sure how strictly speaking, I would, if I were Microsoft, resolve this conundrum. Because you would still eventually want to bubble up the error. It's still a legitimate error, but you would only want to bubble it up if you also meet the predicate. But then, in order to know if you bubble it up, you then have to check the predicate. And so I guess you'd have to check to see if that row actually is one that the user should be allowed to see. And if it is, then bubble up the error. If not, continue on and swallow that error, which is different behavior from how things generally work with the SQL engine. And also, a really clever person could probably get some sort of timing-based attack where I'm going back. It's going back a ways. This is like 16 years old at this point. No, not that old. It's probably about 13 years old at this point. But there was a particular timing attack where you could figure out somebody's .NET machine key because a specific call, if it failed in one way, would respond very quickly. And if it failed in a different way, where it was partially correct, you would have a longer response time. And so people were able to, based on the amount of response time for this particular operation, sort out, oh, I'm on the right track, and now eventually I can figure out what your machine key is. And so the solution to that was essentially Microsoft added, the ASP.NET team added a little bit of jitter to all the response time. So wait some number of milliseconds before actually responding. And that way the two were not statistically significantly different from each other. So Lewis asks, doesn't it just incorporate into the plan? It would seem like row-level security predicate would be pushed lower in the plan for things like an aggregate. Possibly. It could possibly happen that way. My assumption is that all of these predicate operations are available to be processed at the same time, but that the optimizer is only going to pick one at a time to perform filtering on. And so they may look, okay, where customer ID equals 801 is very specific, so maybe I have an index that can drill down on customer ID 801 versus where user context equals Kevin. Maybe user context equals Kevin has a whole bunch of rows. So we may try to apply other elements of the filter earlier because we expect that they'll have fewer rows returned. And we're able to throw away more rows quickly. Also knowing that the predicate check is usually more expensive. It's usually one of the more expensive things that you can do. If you're using session context, it's not a real burden. But if I had to go look up against a table to see if Kevin is allowed to access this particular row, we may be doing one table select for every row in this table, and that's a very expensive predicate. So without knowing what the people who implemented a particular row-level security predicate did, and knowing that this is also a function that runs for every row, the filters that are more likely to be low cardinality, I would assume, operate on first. And that would be explicit statements in the where clause like this, where I have, here is my column and I have a static value. Doesn't change the fact that it can happen since it has been demonstrated. Yeah. And there could be other scenarios in which this particular attack vector doesn't work. So like in your case where you're talking a large aggregation and where maybe the security predicate is in fact the most selective predicate, or perhaps that's an option. But yeah, this was an interesting article. it's been a good series so far. The dynamic data masking series was basically dynamic data masking sucks, and here's why. Row level security series has been actually row level security doesn't quite suck. It's got problems, but it doesn't quite suck if you do it right. But then if you do it right, you have to spend a lot more time optimizing your security policy. You have to make sure that not only do I enable row level security, but that I make sure the right people have access to modify those predicates, that the data is secured upstream and downstream, that all of these situations I'm controlling for. So it's not just a matter of turn on this feature and cool, your system is secured. That said, I've still never seen SQL Server row level security in a production environment.
It's too new, Kevin.
I know it's only 7 years old at this point.
For security. Yeah.
For the average DBA, it's got to be like 15 years or older before anybody touches it.
That's what I meant.
So I look forward to those DBAs learning about the date and time data types that came out in SQL Server 2008. So they've reached vintage at this point, so you can start using them now. Man, wait till 4 years from now when they get stuff like date time 2. All right.
Well,
Go ahead, Mike.
I just ordered one of those books you told me about in 2019. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. 4 years ago.
Yeah.
Feels
There's
good.
whole
Like
other
time flies.
version of SQL Server since then. But if you're using 2019 in the office, it's probably better to get the 2019 book
Yes.
instead of the 2022.
And it's a good book. As long as you can get used to different flavors of writing in the same book, I like that book. It's a good book.
By the way, the book that we're talking about, specifically, Mike was asking about, I want to learn database administration and also some security-related stuff along the way. And so this is me shilling just a little bit for Pro SQL Server 2019 Administration, a guide for the modern DBA. Book authors are happy if you buy every edition. It's not wrong. It's not wrong. The royalties still continue. But Mala recommended the book. I looked at the blurb and said, yeah, this seems reasonable. And seems like a good way to get going as a database administrator versus a database developer. So we've got...
Yeah, I was telling.
Oh, go ahead.
We're finally, after working on it since 2018, the context was, I was asking Mala and Kevin that I'm really getting into SQL Server, and I also I write a lot of queries. I don't really do a lot of like roles, privileges, and all that stuff. So it's a little different in SQL Server than Oracle. So I have to tell the DBAs kind of what I need more accurately.
Yeah, and it makes sense. I think that's also a good thing to know about, even if you are not administering a SQL Server. At least getting an idea of some of the basics of database administration, so that you know some of the constraints that DBAs are under, some of the reasons why they ask for specific things, and also potentially sometimes. Let me push back a little bit, because that feature actually has been in SQL Server for 8 years. And so you could easily turn it on. So let's have the conversation instead of pretending that it's not possible. Not that I'm going to call anybody out about that. But those conversations do happen on occasion. And good to at least know. Now, if you're polite and nice and not me, you phrase it as, oh, well, what about this feature? It seems like that might help. And then the other person can say, yes, that feature. I am definitely aware of that feature, but I'm going to have to research it to make sure that I am fully cognizant of the implications of enabling it in our environment, as opposed to, oh, crap, you called me out. I have no idea I'm going to Google that real fast when I get back to my desk. Which, SQL Server is a huge product. It's okay to say, I don't know what that feature is. And
Right.
there are features that if somebody asked me about it, I would say, I don't know what that thing is. And yeah, I could go back to my desk and Google it. It is really useful to know how to do admin even if you just write T-SQL, because if the admin has it wrong, it's going to be a lot of extra work for the T-SQL programmers. Definitely true, Lewis. Paint is pretty
Right.
nice on Windows.
Right, and I have 100 users, so I would think that we have many databases within our product, and then we have further have 2 or 3 schemas we use, and all my data objects that my clients would use would be within one schema. So I do need to know it a little better, because it will, just like you just they just texted, it would definitely help me communicate better, and then help the clients better too if they have permission issues and stuff.
Yeah. Definitely worthwhile in that regard. Helpful in understanding as well what are some of the reasons why you're doing things a certain way, and even say it could help you become a better T-SQL developer in the process as well. So, question, is SQL Server 2022 applicable to learn for real-world use cases? Because companies usually don't use the latest software, right? I have a rant about that. Unfortunately, the last couple of years, Microsoft has stumbled right back into Service Pack 1 itis, which Service Pack 1 itis, if you're not aware of this, it's my term for a thing that has been pretty common in the Microsoft world, that administrators don't like to move to a new version of a product, SQL Server, Exchange, whatever, until it has reached Service Pack 1. And this goes back quite a ways. Back in 2005, I remember there being these same sorts of arguments that, whoa, we're not just going to wait. We're going to wait till Service Pack 1. And actually, SQL Server 2005, RTM, you really wanted to wait for Service Pack 1. It was not good out of the box. There were a lot of problems with it, and it did not have all of the functionality that they promised. But they needed to get it out in the year 2005, so they released it in December so that they could make their deadline. But even then, they told people, we're putting SP1 out real fast. So historically, there had been that push. Now, I would say about a decade ago, it changed to where, look, don't wait for Service Pack 1. Just make the jump, because the testing systems had been in pretty good shape. Things were working pretty well. There weren't a whole lot of catastrophic failures at release time. And as a result, there was a lot more confidence with SQL Server 2012, 2014, 2016. This changed. What would you say, Mala? Was it 2019 or was it 2017 where we saw the change? I think it was 2019.
2019.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
2019 was the first edition of SQL Server after Microsoft basically said, we're doing most of our testing on Azure SQL Database. So Azure SQL DB has new features that come out. They're doing all of their testing there, and then they roll it into the box product. And SQL Server 2019 and 2022 have both had a lot of problems, a lot of bugs, like Mala mentioned. There's been at least one cumulative update that was rolled back entirely, and there may have been 2 of those. But there are new features that just don't work as expected. There are old features that have broken. And this doesn't affect all companies in all environments. But for risk-averse companies where there's a good amount of effort necessary to move a SQL Server edition, like if I'm doing this for 100 instances, then they're very busy instances, well, I'm going to wait until I'm comfortable before we we pushed it. And Lewis says the grapevine is that Satya axed the QA division. And that I'd heard the same thing. So whether that's true or not, I'm not sure. But I will say over the past few years, I have seen more problems, more bugs in SQL Server than I had in prior years. And that's painful because there's a lot of neat stuff in 2019 from the standpoint of a SQL developer or from a database administrator. There's neat stuff in 2022 from a database developer, especially, but also a DBA, that companies are holding off on because they're concerned that, well, when will it be stable? And so they're kind of holding until there are enough cumulative updates that have fixed most of the serious problems. So you're getting back into a pattern of, well, we're going to wait until there are 5 or 6 cumulative updates before we're confident. And we start trying it out. So all that said, yes, many companies are going to be hesitant to move. I still think it is useful to learn about and try out newer editions because of a couple of reasons. One is eventually they will move. A lot of companies were on 2008 forever. They're now on 2012, 2014, 2016, 2017. There's a good number who are on 2019. And the number who's on 2022, probably pretty small right now. But it will increase over time. And so there is still benefit in learning about that functionality. And even if people say 2022 is a skip edition, let's say hypothetically there's like a SQL Server 2024 or 2025, and that ends up being rock solid and everybody loves it. It's got great new features and everyone jumps to it. All that stuff that you learned about in 2022, 98% of that is still valid for the next edition. There may be a couple of things that change, as in, well, it used to behave this way, now it behaves differently. But 98% of this product is built on the basis of a long series of prior versions. So that's why I would say it's still worthwhile to try it out. I think it's still worthwhile if you're learning anything about SQL Server, learn it on the latest version. You may also learn it on your company's version, because if your company is 6 years behind or 10 years behind, then there may be new functionality which can help solve problems that you don't currently have a good answer to. And that might actually be an impetus to get things pushed. Like, actually let me link to a talk that I do on,
Let's see.
it's called Teaching Old Dogs New Tricks. And the idea of this talk is, let's walk through each SQL Server edition version from 2012 forward and talk about what were the new things for T-SQL developers specifically that were interesting in each subsequent version. And I have a demo repo which has scripts broken down by SQL Server 2012 through 2022. And there are certain types of problems which become much easier to solve in later versions of SQL Server than they would be in an older version. So that might be a good reason to for a company to nudge. I think, yeah, Lewis says admins don't like to. I would have said admins don't like to change unless there's something major for them. And there's a lot of truth to that. Now, I think there's also truth to admins certainly don't like to change for the sake of change. But if you can make the business case, or if you can make the internal case that, hey, with SQL Server 2022, we could use this feature and cut out thousands of lines of code. Or we could use this feature and it would make our query results this much faster. Then that's worth a lot more than, well, it's the newest version and Microsoft wants us to move to it. So I think there is a way to nudge companies, but it is also important to remember that, yeah, there are bugs in the product. There are cumulative updates that happen on a pretty regular basis, and some of the things that they catch are kind of bad. Like Mala mentioned, Query Store having memory dumps. And that's not a good thing because, that's Query Store is a mainline feature. It's a very big deal. And
Right.
when you have parameter sensitive plan optimization turned on, if it starts doing memory dumps, that's where you ask, how much did you actually test this product?
Complex products need QA. I really don't like the whole. Some people put it down to agile, but whatever that reason, maybe just getting rid of QA on big complex products tends to tank the quality really badly. We've seen so much evidence of that.
Yeah, definitely agree.
Yeah.
So, all right, that is going to do it for tonight. And we didn't even get to Mike's last question, but that's okay, Mike. We'll get to it next time.
Yeah, and I'll come up with some more. I just bought both those books, so
There we go. So, Mike will have more questions for us. So,
you guys caused me to spend 150 bucks. I can't believe you guys.
that is what I do. I cause people to spend money. Ask my wife. Usually it's myself to spend money. But one quick note that tomorrow at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, we are going to have Weston Goodwin, who is a first-time presenter. He's out of the, I think he's out of the D.C. area. He's definitely in the Virginia area. He is going to talk to us about containerized applications, and a tool called SQL Simulator. So check that out. Hopefully, we'll see you tomorrow night. And what is this here about? So this is Shop Talk. This is every 2 weeks we just get together, have a little banter, talk topics, and a little bit of chat Q&A. The rest of the time, the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group, we spend a lot of time on technical talks, so SQL Server and data platform related issues. Basically, those tend to be more classical training style talks. This is much more relaxed, informal Q&A style where people have questions. I rant for a while. Sometimes somebody else gets a word in edgewise. That's Shop Talk in a nutshell. But unfortunately, our time is up. So until we see each other either next time on Shop Talk or at a future TriPass event, everyone, take care.
Bye.